It's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a different person then.
You're entirely bonkers. But I'll tell you a secret. All the best people are.
Hello again, and welcome back finally to the main series. I'm your host, and today we are looking at the 1951 adaptation of Lewis Carroll's classic Alice in Wonderland. This script was written by Timmy. So thank you, Timmy. If you're new here, welcome for the first time of I hope many, and if you're returning, I thank you once again for your continued patronage. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into this together. This is probably the single film that Walt Disney was most destined to someday fully make, dating all the way back to his loosely Lewis Carroll-inspired live-action/animation hybrid Alice's Wonderland comedy short from 1923. While he never fully released this first film, he did use it as an example with which to show Margaret J. Winkler what he was capable of, thereby securing funds from Winkler to go on to make a series of 57 shorts about a little girl named Alice and her animated cat Julius, having adventures in an animated landscape. After several stops and starts on the potential production of a full-length Alice feature of some sort, including another hybrid live-action/animation film that Mary Pickford herself pitched to Disney but that was ultimately decided against, Disney finally began serious plans to start production on an Alice film in 1938, after the whopping success of Snow White the year before.
We got one!
That year of 1938, he acquired the rights to the John Tenniel illustrated version of Alice in Wonderland, and then assigned storyboard artist Al Perkins to develop the initial story treatment. In late 1939, a Leica reel was made, but the concept art was deemed by Walt to be too close to the original Tenniel illustrations, making them, among other things, difficult to translate to actually animating. Walt, in general, lost interest in pursuing the project all that actively at this point, allowing development to continue, but expressing his general malaise about the project at several points. Walt was not one to rush a project he really cared about, and he knew how long the production of a single film could sometimes take, from initial planning to actual production, and then again till actual release. Production development continued lazily along in the background without much supervision from Walt himself until late 1942, when, in response to a funding ultimatum from Joseph Rosenberg on behalf of the Bank of America, Walt slowed and then very shortly thereafter completely stopped any active production on an Alice film. Alice in Wonderland was a book and a tale and a concept and a character and a world that was incredibly dear to Walt personally, going back all the way to his childhood, and this was a movie he was intent on getting perfect. That is this third era of Disney, that started with Cinderella and which is usually referred to as the Silver Age, in a nutshell. I call this the era of Walt's final dreams, because almost every film he ended up fully producing in this period, he'd had the idea for by 1940, with the notable exception of 101 Dalmatians, which itself wouldn't be written until the mid-1950s, and so these films were all the stories he'd been thinking about for years, if not decades, by the time the era actually kicked off in 1950 with Cinderella. Alice, coming out second in this era the next year, was probably the story Walt had been thinking about making for the longest, as I've illustrated so totally and repeatedly here, and so it is almost perfectly indicative of the era as a whole. These films, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, The Sword and the Stone, and The Jungle Book. With the exception of Lady and the Tramp, which was based on an idea pitched to Walt in 1937 by story artist Joe Grant, these are all Disney stories which were based on tales that had been of great importance to Walt. The classic fairy tale Cinderella, and especially Charles Perrault's Cendrillon, J.M. Barrie's play Peter Pan, the classic fairy tale Sleeping Beauty, and again especially Charles Perrault's version, the various versions of the legends and exploits of King Arthur, Rudyard Kipling's collection of stories known as The Jungle Book, and finally, and perhaps most dear to him of all, Charles Dodgson/Lewis Carroll's surreal masterpiece, Alice in Wonderland. This is part of the reason that Disney Animation entered its third era so laser-focused, sure of itself, and raring to go for the new decade ahead, with the two productions of Cinderella and Alice racing to the finish line to see who could be released in theaters first. Cinderella ultimately won, and so the little English girl in the blue dress became the second lead character for Disney in the 1950s. Various attempts were made throughout the 4 years following 1942 to get production started back up again on the project.
If I had to do it all over again and had to take bids all over again, I would still do it all over again. I would do it all over again. I'd do it 15 times over again.
Usually similar to the earlier Mary Pickford pitch, with the idea of having a live-action actor in the lead. However, this idea never completely sat right with Walt himself, and it was not until seeing bold and colorful concept art from background artist and genius Mary Blair that Walt was finally excited enough about the project to fully start up its active production again. In 1946, Walt greenlit his final version of the film that eventually came to full fruition 5 long years later, heavily based on those early submissions from Blair. Coming on the heels of the 1940s and the package/wartime film era, Alice in Wonderland is almost the ultimate package film, a narrative collection of shorts that allows the previous era to reach its final insane form. Much more on the episodic storyline as we get along. It's interesting that this is one of the few classic films that Disney never attempted any direct-to-video follow-up of, which is odd in a way, considering that the live-action reimagining/sequel to this film, 2010's Tim Burton-directed Alice, was one of the first live-action films to receive a sequel of its own. As it is, I love that this original is unsullied by a silly, pointless, and probably not very good direct-to-video animated second chapter from the 90s or 2000s. As mentioned earlier, while this film was initially in a race with the production of Cinderella to see which could be finished first, Alice wouldn't come out until a year later, and was not nearly the box office success that second princess film had been. However, while less successful from both a financial and critical standpoint initially, being a $1 million loss upon first release, Alice was massively successful when re-released in 1974, and given a critical reappraisal that went much better, the art style especially being appreciated far more this time around. In addition to that, Alice was one of the first Disney films to be released for VHS, as early as 1981. It was also, even in the 1950s and 60s, one of the most often played films on the magical world of Disney on television, as, due to the episodic nature of the film, it was a very easy one for young viewers to join partway through without feeling like they'd missed anything. That's what this movie is, just an amazing time to sit back and let happen to you. There is an excellent fan theory that I subscribe to, and that is a small detail in my own wider Disney Princess-verse theory, so I will tell you about it right now. The theory goes that because Heather Angel voiced both Alice's sister in the opening and closing of this film, as well as Mrs. Darling in Peter Pan 2 years later in 1953, Alice's sister and Mrs. Darling are therefore one and the same character. The timelines match up perfectly history-wise, and to add to this, the two characters have an extremely similar visual design. Add to this that Catherine Beaumont, who we will discuss in more depth in a little while, is the voice of both Alice in this film and Wendy in Peter Pan, and we can conclude that Alice is the eccentric aunt of Wendy, Michael, and John. Perhaps Peter at one point took Alice to Neverland too. Alice in Neverland. There's an idea. A movie this episodic, defined by being structureless and chaotic, bizarre and unplottable, works in large part because of just how very disconnected each sequence is from the one before it or the one after. Characters visually do reappear fairly often, popping in and out, such as the Cheshire Cat, the White Rabbit, the Dodo, and any of the tea time guests, but each sequence and set of characters that Alice interacts with has its own structure, arc, and outcome. Each scene a tiny story in itself, teaching Alice a new lesson each time. It's almost like if Fantasia had a lead character and a narrative through arc, because like both Fantasia films, as well as several of the package films, Alice in Wonderland has music almost constantly throughout the entire runtime, whether that is the ever-present score, the characters singing in almost every scene, or delivering poetry set to music. This is one of the most unique films in the canon, a hybrid of Disney package film mixed with the traditional protagonist setup of a regular screen narrative, all while being the first of Disney's hidden world subgenre, one of their most niche types of offerings, only containing 7 films. Go watch my 2 videos on the Disney subgenres to learn more. A film this supremely episodic might not work quite so well but for the fact that there really are no weak sequences at all. We go straight from the opening song to the White Rabbit and door sequence to Tweedledee and Tweedledum to Giant Alice stuck in a house to the singing flower ladies to the caterpillar. Every single frame and line of this film feels effortlessly hilarious, classic, and most of all, fun.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
I did, in fact, include both Alice and Wendy in my very recent and quite expanded Disney Princess ranking list, which has just come out a couple of weeks ago, as especially Alice basically functions exactly like a typical Disney princess in lots of ways. Her story opens with an I Want song, and she goes on a journey of growth, maturity building, and self-discovery, eventually having a second, more emotional song later on, and then finally dealing with a big theatrical villain at the end, before being returned to her old life, having grown and changed for the better. This film feels like one of the most childlike and wondrous in the entire Disney canon, in large part, I would say, because it had some of the most input from an actual child on the film's production staff. Catherine Beaumont carries so much of the load of the vocals and does it so spectacularly that would be enough on its own. However, this film was made in the era in which Disney films often filmed live-action versions of many scenes to use as reference for the animators later on, and in the case of Alice in Wonderland, the entire movie was filmed live-action beforehand, just so Walt could see if he even liked each scene or not. That meant that Beaumont had to not only give a more involved vocal performance than almost any other child of 10 has had to give in the history of animation, voicing one of the most famous characters in fiction, but she also had to physically act out the entire part on camera as well, in costume, with adult actors alongside her portraying any number of things. What came out of that extremely organic process was a film that is as close to being entirely from the mind of a 10-year-old child as any other film possibly could be. That she happened to be a genius-level voice actor and gave an almost indescribably mature performance is what then makes this the perfect storm for Alice in Wonderland to be one of the finest and purest films for and by children ever made. There are a few select Disney voice performances that come to mind when I so much as think the phrase Disney animation. Performances like Robin Williams as the genie,
You're getting your wishes, so
Pat Carroll as Ursula, Eleanor Audley as Maleficent,
Listen well, all of you.
Zachary Levi as Eugene Fitzherbert.
This is kind of an off day for me. This doesn't normally happen.
These are performances by actors that have etched themselves into the very identity of the company and the canon. I would put forward the thought that one of the best and earliest examples of one of these all-time iconic Disney voices is Catherine Beaumont, as the instantly recognizable Alice.
I am not a mile high, and I'm not leaving.
Alice is, to me, one of Disney's most naturally charming and likable lead characters ever, even despite, or perhaps partially because, she can actually at times be quite abrasive and cross, but never without some good reason. I love how in the opening, Alice's actions mirror visually what her sister is reading to her, showing that Alice is, in her own way, listening to and processing the information. Alice has one of the best and cleanest visual designs of any Disney character ever. Her color scheme of yellow hair, white apron and stockings, and bright blue dress that brings out her eyes is instantly, and I hate to keep using this overused word, iconic. Alice is, however, just an iconic Disney design. Simple, elegant, and practically perfect in every way. I also love how just a little bit of her blonde hair always rests on her shoulders, no matter which way her head is facing. I love how Alice periodically gives herself what she already knows is good advice. She is quirky without ever trying to be, which is the only charming kind. She's so matter-of-fact about everything, taking all the nonsense she encounters in perfect stride. She is shrunken to the size of a mouse suddenly and falls inside the bottle she just drank from, whisked away in a river of her own giant tears, and her only response is to laconically remark, "Oh dear, I do wish I hadn't cried so much."
Oh dear, I do wish I hadn't cried so much.
Disney's Alice in Wonderland, based as all hell. Another example is when the Cheshire Cat informs her that most everyone in Wonderland is insane, including himself, before slowly unraveling himself into the void. Her response is, "Well, if people here are like that, then I must try not to upset them."
Goodness. If the people here are like that, I must try not to upset them.
That's a bloody mature and well-reasoned response for a 10-year-old kid, and it makes me laugh every time. Alice's only real motivation, being curiosity, is, rather than a detriment due to its simplicity, actually a strength of the film. Because all Alice cares about is satisfying that curiosity, she is a perfect avatar for any child simply wanting to experience the wonder of animation and the perfectly calibrated, poetic nonsense of Lewis Carroll. Alice's constant changes in size can be interpreted in many ways, but my favorite is seeing it as a way to represent Alice's confidence and her emotions in general. When she is especially tiny, she often feels very low and down. She isn't taken seriously by anyone and can't accomplish anything. But when she is a giant, she is feared by everyone. Her large emotions follow suit, and she is overconfident and brash, as obviously at that size she knows nobody can challenge her, not even the Queen. Alice, early on, smartly finds the middle ground as fast as she can, making sure to cannily save the bits of mushroom that alter her size after returning herself to her proper height. This then in turn can be interpreted, of course, as Alice learning to gain control of her emotions. At the end of the day, what Alice is supremely relatable. We are all sometimes stuck in a wonderland of our own, and I do mean stuck. It can be intoxicating to get trapped in a fantasy, but Alice struggles with the madness of it all, in a world where nothing matters and anything goes, including sudden capital punishment. We have all been Alice many, many times, contending with our own nonsensical friends, ridiculous acquaintances, confusing instructions, unfamiliar landscapes, and insane, rage-mad, allergic to seeing reason authority figures. Beaumont gives in this film no less than one of the best and most likable voice performances ever. And she elevates an already gorgeous package to even greater heights than it could have achieved with any other little girl. In a World of My Own is one of my favorite Disney songs of all time, and if you think about it, is one of Disney's earliest I Want songs, as I mentioned a little earlier. While even some fully official Disney princesses don't get their own I Want song, Alice has one of my favorites ever, as well as another song of her own later on that I'll get to in a minute. I adore the lyrics here, showing Alice dreaming the kind of pleasant nonsense she does most any day, and foreshadowing the sort of delusion we and Alice are about to experience in Wonderland. In a World of My Own is not only a gorgeous, lilting, lazy melody that would be lovely sung by almost anyone, but Beaumont sings it with effortless naturalism, not trying to overdo anything, merely breathing the song to life in a simple, quiet, and beautiful wish. Songs like this, delivered by voices of this caliber, are the kind of elements that make Disney that premier wish-making and granting entity when they are at their best and producing art like Alice. As a final note on this song, I love the moment visually where she first sings the actual words, "In a World of My Own." She lies back into the flowers, and just before the shot cuts, the last of her dress falls below the flower line, hiding her body entirely from view. This is a fantastically clever bit of visual foreshadowing as to the journey she is about to take down the rabbit hole, as well as corresponding perfectly to the words Alice is singing at that very moment. In the Golden Afternoon, sung to Alice by the flowers, and eventually finished by Alice, is a gorgeous number, and feels almost like a throwback to several different sequences from the just recently finished package film era, which was the era in which this film spent more than half of its production time. Very Good Advice is a wonderful moment in the film, a quiet scene of reflection, where Alice realizes that all the good advice she's given herself means nothing if she cannot actually follow through on that advice when the time comes. This scene epitomizes the struggle of so many children to do the things they know are the right thing to do, even if they aren't always the easiest or most enjoyable options available to them. This song represents growing up, facing the reality and harshness of a world where things don't always make sense, and sometimes the most sensible thing to do is just to sit down and have a good cry. I love the way that the nonsense creatures of the forest slowly fade away to nothing around her, as Alice loses the thread of the song and gives over to her sobbing, leaving her, finally, totally alone within this so-called Wonderland. Painting the Roses Red is another fantastic song with bouncy and clever lyrics and another number that Alice joins in by the end. I love how agreeable Alice truly is, and how she's always willing to instantly join in with whatever silliness is being perpetrated, so long as those that are doing it are going to be pleasant to her. This also means that Beaumont sings on 4 different tracks in the film, a very high number for even a Disney lead. A Very Merry on Birthday is simple and perfectly effective, creative in its stupidity and inane by design, like every other element of this film is striving to be. The score in general is terrific, and the songs are all lovely, with none feeling out of place or weak. The idiosyncratic poetic style of Carol is fused together with the charming whimsy of the music so well that it all feels as if it were written side by side to begin with, and all the singers, led by Beaumont, are top-notch and achieve exactly what they are going for. As mentioned in the intro, concept artist and painter, and Walt Disney's personal favorite artist, Mary Blair, was the mad genius behind the insanely unique visual style of this film. Colors all throughout are so vibrant and vivid, maybe the most extreme example of bold color use in the entire Disney canon, traditional or CGI. Certainly one of the most distinct and purely visually beautiful animated films ever. Mary Blair's concept art for this film is some of the most striking and creative I've ever seen, and I urge you to look it up all on your own time after watching this review, even more so than the ones I'm showing on screen right now. Blair was a complete master of her art form, and one of the greatest visual architects behind the famous Disney look. The character designs are another massive strength here. Everyone that Alice encounters is so blobby and weird and different from one another. As mentioned earlier, the entire film, just like the human scenes in Cinderella, was shot first in live action, with Catherine Beaumont and the other voice actors or physical performers, and then this footage was used as direct inspiration for the animators. This means that, while Alice herself remained extremely close to how a real girl would look and move on screen, the animators were able to use her as their realism North Star, while they continued to imagine yet more and more zany visions and ridiculously shaped characters to begin with. In a visual sense, this means that because Alice is the only real element from the real world, and she's the only thing that looks absolutely real on screen, we are totally immersed in this world of fancy visually, and we totally buy into it, because she is just so much what she should be. Different production teams worked on the different segments of the film somewhat independent of each other, racing to both finish their scenes first and also outdo one another in insanity, giving this film its trademark disjointed, fragmented, and generally extremely episodic vibe. This also leads to the movie feeling positively stuffed to the brim with various and constant gags, and layer upon layer of visual jokes and animated silliness, whether based on author Carol or imagined by the filmmakers themselves. The March Hare literally pouring an actual china cup of tea out of the spout of his teapot is an amazing example of these astonishingly inventive visual gags. The same goes for the hare cutting his tea midstream as if his ears were scissors, as well as sawing his teacup in half before requesting just half a cup. The entire tea time sequence is a masterclass in poetic and hand-drawn comedy, and it makes sense that this has become the most famous scene in the whole movie, capped off, of course, by my favorite line delivery in the entire film. The Mad Hatter replying to the March Hare's suggestion of mustard on the White Rabbit's pocket watch with the line,
Mustard? Don't let's be silly.
"Don't let's be silly." I laugh out loud every single time. Well, in honor of Walt and Mary, I'm about to take a little smoke break, so be back in a moment, folks.
Treat your taste kindly with Kent Smoke Kent, the micronite filter cigarette.
In a film this episodic and lead character focused, it really is Alice and everyone else. The thing is, everyone else is incredible across the board. Characters that appear for even a few moments are at least casually memorable, and the ones that get an entire scene to themselves interacting with Alice are, to a man, absolutely amazing. The voice work in this film is truly some of the best ever of any entry in the canon. Tweedledee and Tweedledum are so rubbery and bouncy, so visually appealing and fun to listen to. I always forget that they're about to come up in the movie, and then they always feel just as fresh. The marvelously versatile J. Pat O'Malley brought Tweedledee and Tweedledum to life.
O'Malley! Alan!
just as he had for Cyril, Mr. Toad's horse, a few years before. And he also, of course, voices the walrus and the carpenter in their segment. The dodo is fantastic in both of his scenes, especially his second appearance attempting to smoke the giant monster Alice out of the White Rabbit's house. Both of these roles, the dodo and the White Rabbit, were provided by the incredible Bill Thompson, who provided, among many other voices, Mr. Smee in Peter Pan, King Hubert in Sleeping Beauty, and perhaps most celebrated of all by some people, Jock in Lady and the Tramp. Bill Thompson was just an absolutely incredibly talented and chameleonic accent performer. Just so good. One of my favorite moments in the entire film is the caterpillar, now a butterfly, screaming, "A mushroom, of course!" after she asks him what he means by "one side will make you grow taller, the other will make you grow shorter." The fantastic character actor Richard Haydn performed the voice of the caterpillar. The Cheshire Cat, voiced by the immortal Sterling Holloway, is one of the all-time great Disney supporting characters, both visually and voice-wise. Everything about him is what is special about the film itself. He's zany, poetic, hilarious, and fun every time he decides to show himself, as well as more than a little menacing and unsettling. He's kind of a creepy dude, but he's fun. The March Hare and the Dormouse are each fantastic and silly in their own ways, and then of course my favorite supporting character in the film is the Mad Hatter, voiced to monumental comedic heights by the great Ed Wynn. Ed Wynn is a comedy voice that you know even if you've never heard the man himself. That's how truly iconic his imprint on the entertainment world is. Even other later Disney characters can't help but be directly inspired by him. The main villain of Wreck-It Ralph, King Candy, is a direct auditory and visual takeoff on Wynn's performance of the Mad Hatter in this film.
You wouldn't hit a guy with glasses, would you? You hit a guy with glasses. That's well played.
My goodness, those are the things that upset me.
Voiced in that film by Alan Tudyk.
Alan! 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 Alan!
That guy's the modern chameleon, good lord. I will also note that I am an enormous fan of Johnny Depp's live-action interpretation of the character opposite Mia Wasikowska in both 2010 and 2016.
I don't like it in here. It's terribly crowded.
Yeah, I watched those both recently. Ranking for all of the live-action remakes and reimaginings and sequels coming soon, and I like both of those quite a bit. So yeah. Verna Felton is another one of those all-time great Disney voices, and this might be her signature performance. It's hard to say for sure, though, because her three most well-known voice roles, as Cinderella's fairy godmother the year before this, the Queen of Hearts in this film, and Flora, one of the three good fairies and leads of 1959's Sleeping Beauty, are all incredibly magical in their own way. However, her turn here as the Queen of Hearts must win out as the most memorable of all, in many ways. Disney villains are hard to get right, and they're especially hard to get right when they don't even show up until an hour into the film, and they aren't even mentioned until 4 minutes before that. Again, however, in literally only 13 minutes of actual screen time, Verna Felton was able to make the Queen of Hearts one of the most memorable, and far away the most unhinged and bloodthirsty of any Disney villain. She is a classic, and it would never have made sense for her to be woven in and out of the plot anyway. She's the final boss, rather than the only one. She is Alice's last, final, most insane challenge before she can wake up and return home. I also love that, for all of the Queen's 13 minutes of screen time, she is sharing the screen with Alice, and directly interacting with her for almost that entire time too. That's a lot more direct interaction than you actually get between most Disney villains and their protagonists. Looking at you, Oliver and Bill Sykes from Oliver and Company, and you too, Pocahontas and Governor Ratcliffe, especially. To put it simply, Verna Felton effing killed this role. She's a bellowing, abrasive, angry, nasty, egocentric, difficult, immature, rageaholic mess, and I love every second of it. Alice's struggles to placate her are some of my favorite battles with any Disney villain, matches made up entirely of wit and manners. It's the perfect representation of trying to reason with someone who simply will not be reasoned with, the eternal and universal struggle of arguing with an idiot. The Queen of Hearts is like Chernabog, a full-fledged force of freaking nature. Now I have to get my power cord before the critics roundup, because, whoo boy, we running low.
I am never going to financially recover from this.
Alright, now it's time for the Critics Roundup, which is the time in these videos that I take out to read some selected views from, in this case, 22 different reviewers from both YouTube and online, and we read a small summary of what they had to say, if they had to say something, and we tell you where they ranked this film in their rank of the Disney animated classics. And eventually I'll do my own ranking video, but for now we just get to hear the critics roundup and where they all put it, and then I tabulate them as an average. You know the drill. L.S. Mark, 34th, says that it was underwhelming and too episodic for him until the climax, which he loved. Praises the performances of both Beaumont and Felton, but says that it's just not the kind of thing he can personally get into. Schaeferless Productions, 11th, compliments the voice acting from Alice, the characters, the animation, the energy, everything in general, and calls it the best classic Disney film. Sean Chandler, 18th, says it captures modern humor well and all the sequences are memorable and classic. Brian Hull, 29th, praises the Mad Hatter. The Trove, 21st, says it is episodic but super likable with amazing animation, praises Alice as a lead character. Dave Lee Down Under, 18th, says the animation is innovative and stunning. Modern Mouse, 9th, calls it S tier, one of the greatest. The 90s Kid, 32nd to 40th. The Glad in Gladiator, 34th, calls it an outstanding movie. Chris Itua, 23rd, says that while it's a bit unorthodox in terms of narrative, all of her encounters with the different characters are pretty entertaining and make for a really fun watch. Maple Street Movies, 23rd, calls it great, says he loves how zany and crazy it is, and that Alice is one of his favorite Disney characters ever. The Movie Geek, 37th, says that the bright, vibrant colors will attract kids, but that there isn't much in Alice in Wonderland for older audiences. Justin Watches Movies, 10th. That was the YouTube critics, and now it's time for the selected thoughts of the online critics, and let's see what they had to say. Collider, 31st, says that it could have been something spectacular, but that while it is colorful, funny, and strange, it's also oddly flavorless. Unshaved Mouse, 35th, says that it was a big leap forward after Cinderella, that it's much funnier than that film, and that it's Disney's most beautiful since Bambi. Cinema Blend, 31st, says that it succeeds in properly capturing the nonsense of Lewis Carroll, and that it is weird but in a good way. Weird.
Weird.
I love you, Rachel, I'm sorry.
So we didn't do that this time.
Your film will come out someday. Someday my film will come. Hollywood.com, 8th, says that it knows when to stay grounded and also when and how high to soar. Calls it goofy, haunting, affectionate, cruel, and always interesting. Paste Magazine, 29th, calls it one of Disney's most surreal, psychedelic, and unforgettable films ever, and says that it has kept the legacy of Carroll's work alive. Slash Film, 42nd, says that it isn't great, that it's wild but feels slight, similar to the package film era. Screen Rant, 32nd, calls it a delightful tale of madcap whimsy, and that while it wasn't well received initially, it has since become a Disney classic. The Playlist, 27th, says that it is genuinely trippy and visually spectacular, and that its versions of some characters are near definitive, but that the music isn't great, Alice is a bit boring, and the story is a bit too episodic. Darth Docking on Reddit, 56th. Oi, 56th. I mostly have agreed with Darth Docking so far, but damn, son. 22 rankings with an average ranking of 26.9th, or just under 27th. A lowest ranking of 56th, the last one, and a highest ranking of 8th. It was nobody's favorite, obviously, but it was in 3 rankers' top 10s and in 1 ranker's bottom 10, that being Darth Docking. In addition, it appeared in 13 out of 22 rankers' top halves. And as you can see in the updated list I've thrown up there on screen, it is smack dab at 7th in the middle of the 13 films we have reviewed so far, ahead of all 6 of the package film era films in terms of average ranking, and below all 6 of the others. The more I watch and think about this film, the more I love it, and that was true both of my viewings of it growing up, as well as the several times I watched it in preparation for this video. There's something perfectly dreamlike about the experience of watching it, wandering through this world alongside the delightful Alice, a timeless character brought to life by one of the most charming and talented little girls you've ever heard. To me, this film is about many things: learning lessons, growing up, the power of dreams and the dangers of nightmares, and the absolute vastness of a child's imagination. It's about the unexpected and bizarre things we may experience when out and about all alone in the great big world, as Alice frequently finds herself at odds with everyone around her in some way, shape, or form, with nothing but her wits and her charm to get her out of the jam. It's also, of course, just a hell of a trip. It's one of the most insane films you'll ever watch in some ways, and it is super fun, especially to watch under the influence of certain things, but we don't talk about that on this channel. Just look that up for yourself, you dirty animals. I had initially thought I might give this movie something in the range of a 9. But after watching it again, I'm reminded of how truly special it is, and what a trend-setting and influential film it turned out to be. There's really nothing too much I can say negatively about it. It has a fantastic lead, marvelous animation, a unique visual style, amazing side characters, beautiful music, hilarious writing, and a memorable and intimidating villain. The only thing it lacks is a plot, and that is literally by design, so I can't exactly say that's a bad thing, since I love the structure of this film. Ultimately, I'm giving it a 9.5 out of 10. It really is just that great. And that's it! Next week we'll be back again and looking at 1953's Peter Pan, a favorite of one of my brothers, so please do join me for that as well. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're still here, good night, good luck, and enjoy the afterword.
That's all.